Okay, so it's been a while since I have been online, and there's been a fair bit going on in the last few months since I last did a video on either channel. Um, Here in the UK, we've had a fair bit going on. If I'm honest, there's been issues with the policing bill, which has led to a lot of protests earlier in the year in several towns and cities in regards to police powers over protest, um, and the role of the media in protests. We've also had the debate over the national insurance contributions in regards to social care for the elderly and infirm and those in care homes, be it mental health and such. And that's increasing national insurance contributions, and it hits the lowest paid, of which I am one of them. Now, I'm currently on sick leave for a variety of reasons. I had a couple of motorcycle accidents, and there's a few other things going on. But when I do return to work, my national insurance contributions will increase and increase significantly, um, which does adversely affect those at the bottom end. Um, there have been calls from some to tax the wealthier in regards to um, raising tax revenue uh, to support social care and care homes. And I've got friends who work in the care sector. We've also seen issues with obviously Brexit and shortages in a variety of commodities. Obviously, the COVID pandemic over the last year and a half and the effects that's had, a furlough scheme, amongst other things, domestically in the UK. The building trade, for example, there are several uh, small building sites near where I live. Now, where I moved to where I live over a year ago, these building sites were already well underway. They're still not completed. They're both sites that should have taken 3 to 6 months. This is over. They were already well advanced when I moved to the area I'm living in. They're still not finished. So that in itself is interesting. We There's been shortages in all sorts of building supplies. Obviously, the labour market is being affected with a lot of low skilled Europeans going back to the EU, which has led to a shortage of labourers and builders and plumbers and electricians and even skilled workmen. Truck drivers, shortage of them. Um, and now some companies are trying to increase wages as incentives by giving bonuses and giving other incentives to encourage employment in the logistics sector. The, the whole I've got friends who work in that sector as well. I've worked in logistics and the warehouse side of things. Uh, there's been all sorts of issues in the domestic union between Northern Ireland and the UK. Now, I'm apolitical. I don't support a political party. Um, I have a theory that we should be more socially responsible and capitalist at the same time. I'm not a big fan of socialism per se. I'm not a big fan of sole exploitative capitalism. I'm apolitical. I believe that the mainstream political parties have failed this country over successive generations. Um, I can understand the rise of populism. I think there have been failings in the political system, and we can talk about some of the foreign relations blunders that have been made in foreign intervention in Afghanistan, which we've seen the complete and utter mayhem in Kabul in the last couple of weeks. And a lot of that lies with the US administrations, Biden, Trump, and Obama, and Bush. The last four presidents, including the current president, have led to that situation. You could sort of blame Clinton in a way, and Bush Senior as well with the first Gulf War, Middle East foreign policy has been a shambles for 30, 40 years. Um, Plain and simple. That's my view on it. Um, it's shambolic for a long, long time. You go back to the Iranian Revolution. No, it's just going to be on this channel. I'll be live streaming on both channels. I've taken a bit of a break from the main channel as well. Um, I needed a break. There's some stuff going on in my personal life that needed attending to. I've had some health issues over the last couple of months. I've had two serious motorcycle accidents. I've had to go to hospital. I'm on medication, so I can't work at the moment. But I will be going back on the main channel in due course. There's a few sporting events coming up that are of vital importance and interest. On regards to the US going back to Afghanistan, I don't know. I mean, look, we can discuss Afghan modern history since the 60s and 70s with the Soviet involvement in 1979 to 89. In 10 years, they couldn't do what we did in 20, and we failed. Um, which is interesting that um, from 79 to 89 there was Soviet involvement in Afghanistan. That failed in a similar way that the US-led involvements failed over 20 years. That an overseas power had a sphere of influence. They were supporting their you know communist allies in Afghanistan. That failed. Centralized government in Afghanistan fell. The Taliban took over in '95 officially, although weren't recognised by the UN. Western allies, us, NATO, going 20 years ago in December after obviously 9/11, which obviously happened 20 years ago on Saturday. I remember it was a Tuesday. I remember I was at school. Um, that conflict has been mismanaged completely from, I wouldn't say the start. I think the first few years it was the Taliban fell, uh, the NATO-led expedition. It was reasonably peaceful from about 2002 to like 2005, 2006, and that's when um, the death toll and the military involvement went through the roof. It became major foreign policy alongside the Iraq conflict concurrently. Um, when Obama was starting to reduce the amount of US personnel towards in his second term, and Trump as well announced that there will be a full withdrawal by this year. Obviously, the Trump administration hoped they would win the election and therefore um, be in charge, not Biden. Um, the the situation whereby the Biden administration, as soon as they took over, decided to honour the Trump administration's agreement with the Taliban and other parties in Afghanistan, the withdrawal was chaotic, and we saw it played out on live TV. Much similar to the Soviet withdrawal. Soviet withdrawal actually was they just left. They just packed up their columns and went back to um, went back to what is now obviously Uzbekistan was where their bases were, but the Soviet Union at the time, which then collapsed shortly after. In regards to would I be interested in a higher academic? I did study history and politics at college level in this country, or early tertiary education. I didn't go to university. I've been considering an open university degree. Um, my ex partner who recently left me was encouraging me to look at going and doing an open university degree in regards to history and politics. Um, was I ever interested? I don't think university suits every person. And this is a problem of domestic policy in the UK. Was the Blair government encouraged too many people to go to university, and that led to a trade gap, which then led to our reliance on low-paid, low-skilled European labour to fill a labour gap. Not enough people were doing vocational courses. Not enough people were going to college or learning on the job in apprenticeships in regards to mechanics, electricians, builders, plumbers, plasterers, painters. There's a skills gap in that sector, which has never been plugged. The over reliance on cheaper European labour. And I'll use the Polish as an example. They've done a lot in this country. A lot have settled in this country. I know a lot who have decided to stay in this country and not go back to Poland and get British citizenship. But the problem was under the Blair government in '97 to 2007. Um, Everyone was encouraged to go to university for all, and that doesn't work. So I was And I saw so many of my sister's friends and my friends go to university, get degrees, and then not get jobs in the field that they were studying in. And a lot of them have struggled to find employment in the sectors they were studying in with the degrees they've had. And that is an ongoing problem. Is you get this degree, you're saddled with debt. As soon as you hit that threshold, you have to start paying the debt back. Some people never pay it back. The concerns about tuition fees and university finances, the politicization of university. It's it's a problem. Um, I think education should be apolitical. I think there should be no, I think that should be. There's also too much emphasis on exams and hitting targets. There's not enough in the curriculum, I don't think, teaching kids as they're growing up about interest rates, paying bills, home economics, basically, modern home economics, And when you finish university or college or you go into the workplace, the average salary doesn't meet expectations. The cost of living is chronic. I'm living in a studio flat, which is in a reconditioned old living care home, and it's not good quality. I'm not saying it's a bad place to live; it's in a nice area, but the average house price is 500 to 1,000 to 1.5 million. I looked down the local post office co-op. There's a little bit where the local, uh, you know, estate agents advertise rentals and property prices. There's a house down the road from me worth 9 million. 9 million. I will never earn that in my lifetime. I've calculated what I would earn in my working life on the current salary that I'm on, and it would take me my entire working life to earn what Gareth Bale earns in a week in his footballing salary. I would never even earn £1 million. Not unless I win the lottery. So I'm going to play the lottery tomorrow night and hope I win the Euro Millions. That's the only hope I've got of being able to afford a house. Afghanistan is a lost nation. Look, the Soviets have tried, or the Russians, as we call them now. The US has tried to enforce what I would call Western ideals. So you could say, could you class the Soviet Union as a Western nation? I would say they're a developed nation. They're trying to force a centralized government upon a very regional people, tribal people. And the British Empire tried in the 1840s to 1880s to add Afghanistan to the Raj of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and failed. They got to the Khyber Pass, but they never fully tamed Afghanistan. The last time Afghanistan was technically under control of anyone for any period of time was under Alexander the Great, ironically, in the Persian Empire, and we're going back to antiquity. And even then, it was sort of semi-autonomous. It's never really been conquered by anyone. So, you know, um, it's a very tribal nation. It's very divided. There's different tribes, different ethnicities, different cultures. It's a very interesting part of the world, but it's never been in the modern era. I would say in post Middle Ages, it's never really been fully controlled by anyone. Um, every nation, power, of empire of any kind that's ever gone in there has eventually had to leave after a period of time because the locals always rise up. But as a state itself, it's just lines on a map that have been drawn rather than the tribal areas being independent of the states. It's just the Russian Empire, then the Soviets, and the British Empire, because the Russians under the Tsarist regime before 1917 and the British Empire were both, divided over Afghanistan. They both tried to incorporate it into their overseas territories and both failed. The Soviets obviously tried in the 70s and 80s. The USSR, Brezhnev and Khrushchev were the main players when it came to Soviet power in the Middle East and aiding Egypt and Syria and Jordan against Israel. Once Brezhnev leaves power, you have Andropov and Chernenko, and then you have Gorby towards the end. So the Afghan period is from Brezhnev to Gorbachev. But in the Middle East, involving like Egypt and Syria and Jordan, and basically the Arab League against Israel, you have Brezhnev and Khrushchev. bold and bankrupt. Well, Brezhnev wasn't bold; he was just not very well towards the end. Khrushchev, I think, possibly was the best Soviet leader, ironically. And Gorby, I think, is one of those Soviet leaders that I think doesn't get the credit they deserve when it comes to foreign policy, but domestic policy, the Brezhnev era is the reason why the Soviet Union basically collapsed. It wasn't to do with Gorbachev, it wasn't to do with Khrushchev, it was the rise of corruption, the stagnation, and overextending themselves in foreign policy. But that's another thing. Afghanistan's a lost nation. I think the mess that's been caused, I can see foreign intervention in Afghanistan again, be it this time possibly the Chinese and the Russians, because they have an interest, because that's sort of geopolitically near where they are, because there's border states with Russia and China, like Uzbekistan, that border onto Afghanistan. The Indians and the Pakistanis will have an interest. The Iranians, I think it'd be more regional powers that end up going into Afghanistan rather than NATO per se. I think the Chinese may be one of the nations that end up looking at Afghanistan, considering their issues with the Uyghur population in China as a possible issue geopolitically. But I can't see the US going back. I think the US foreign policy has been a mess for 30, 40 years. And because communism is Cold War's ended, the US foreign policy post 45 until 91 was heavily based on countering not only the Soviet threat, but China and Vietnam and Cuba. And the only communist nation that they really don't like apart from North Korea is Cuba. And even then, relations aren't as bad as what they were. Obama went a long way in normalizing them. I mean, the Trump administration is an aberration, really. But hopefully under Biden, communication with Cuba gets a bit better. There seems to be reforms in Cuba that are going in a more positive direction. But US foreign policy was for the best part of 40, 50 years was based upon a standoff between ultra capitalism and democracy on their side, and communism, Marxism on the Soviet side and the Chinese side. And the issue is the European nations and the South American nations were sort of in the middle, and so they developed well, basically. And the former colonial empires of the European nations around the world became proxy battlegrounds for the US-led coalition of NATO and the Warsaw Pact-led coalition of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapses, the US loses its natural enemy, its major natural enemy, that the foreign policy has been discussed all about since 1945. They've defeated Japan in the Pacific. Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy have been defeated in Europe. The natural enemy has to be the Soviet Union. And it's been a shambles because they don't really have a nation to hate apart from North Korea and Cuba, and their relations with Cuba are far better now than what they were in 1991. And the Obama administration, for a lot of its flaws, did some good things with Cuba, and Cuba's going in the right direction. The Trump administration over 4 years has damaged that growing relationship. The US doesn't actually have apart from the Iranians is just the US getting angry because their backed regime was overthrown by a regime that wasn't pro-American. That's the problem with American foreign policy. They keep dictators in power for their own economic interests, and then Iran is the catalyst, I think, for the chaotic American foreign policy post Cold War. The ironic thing is we supported Saddam Hussein in the Iraq-Iran war in the 80s, which was a parallel to the Soviet period in Afghanistan. I mean, I was hoping to do this live stream on current political issues, but it does link back. The Americans were assisting the Afghan resistance to the Soviet occupation in the 70s and 80s with the Mujahideen, which became Al Qaeda and the Taliban, and the Northern Alliance, who were anti-Taliban and anti-Al Qaeda, and they're a different tribal conglomerate, and they're still fighting the Taliban as we speak in their last strongholds. And they were fighting the Taliban long before we got involved in Afghanistan in 2001. Britain's stance with the USSR is interesting because we were sort of more. We had a lot of secret agreements in Eastern Europe that the Americans weren't party to between Churchill and Stalin. And there's a lot of documentaries about that. We got involvement in Greece. Yugoslavia was a very pro-Western communist state that broke with the Soviet Union under Tito, and that's an interesting topic. And I've been to the former Yugoslavia; it's a very interesting place. Um, and the Yugoslav wars is something a lot of us grew up with. I remember watching that on TV. I've got family who live in Italy. Not that I get on with them, but obviously Italy borders Slovenia, which was part of the former Yugoslavia. But yes, in the 70s and 80s, the US very openly were supporting the resistance movement to the communist Afghan government and the Soviet Union. And it's my enemy's enemy's my friend. They now when George Bush Jr. That one, the second Bush, when George Bush became president after Clinton, the Russian Federation under now Putin, formerly Yeltsin, but Putin's obviously been president for 2 years at this point. Were having discussions with the Clinton administration in the hope that Al Gore would be, elected on a strong platform, of the Democrat platform. And they were basically sharing information saying, look, we have concerns about Al Qaeda, we have concerns about Afghanistan and Iraq, and we are wishing to share these concerns about 9/11 and a whole host of things. And this is actually all on the record. And the Clinton administration, in the hope that Al Gore would win that election in 2000, had all these files and discussions with the Russian government in the build up to the election. Now, the Bush administration take over, and they didn't heed the warnings that overseas governments were saying in regards to what has become the Afghan situation. And because Russia's on the Security Council as well, and that is a failing of the early days of the Bush administration, from his inauguration to 9/11. Was those warnings were there. There had been issues in the Gulf, Persian Gulf, the Somalia situation, when Clinton authorised the US involvement. Black Hawk Down, what's that film? The US involvement in the Somali civil war in the 90s. So the issues were already there. And they weren't heeded. And we've reached this point 20 years later. In regards to the British involvement with the USSR, we were a bit more conciliatory. There were meetings between leaders. I think Thatcher's involvement. Thatcher becomes prime minister. That's where the stance changes a bit more to Reagan's policy of, being more anti-USSR, which leads to the breakup of the USSR. But before Thatcher, the British prime ministers were a bit more conciliatory, simply because of the state of Europe, the role of Yugoslavia, and the relationship between the Yugoslavs and us. It was an interesting time. I don't know as much about European involvement with each nation in regards to the Soviet Union, with domestic policy and treaties and discussions and meetings. There were flashpoints with the Berlin Wall. There were flashpoints with the Berlin Airlift in '48, which I studied. But at school, we studied them from the Russian side of things, and the American side of things, rather than the British and European nations' involvement with the West and the East. And as someone who was born in what was West Germany, it's interesting to my life, because when I was born, West and East Germany were still separate states. They weren't reunified for a couple of years after I was born. The Berlin Wall was still an issue. Reunification is still an ongoing issue, I think, in Germany. Unemployment and deprivation are still higher in the East than the West. Investment still lower in the East than the West. The far right's stronger in East Germany than West Germany. There's a social disconnect between East Germany and West Germany, like investments lacking. Um, Large numbers of people have moved to West Germany to find work. Um, uh, you know, there's higher unemployment in the East. It's still ongoing. I don't think, but I think Britain's position was a bit more conciliatory towards the USSR. I mean, the Soviet soldiers didn't leave Austria until the 50s, and we had a joint occupation force. Our involvement in the Greek Civil War, um, you know, there was a whole range of issues going on. But I think, yeah, under Thatcher, the stance changes towards the end of the Cold War. But before Thatcher, I think it was a little bit more flexible. There were more, discussions. It was less, it, even though there was still, you know, preparations made for nuclear war. I mean, you look at the Bond films in the 60s and 70s under with Roger Moore. That's the tension that there was there. There was always nuclear drills. There were posters. There were advertisements, especially in America, about um, people building nuclear bunkers. Um, so yeah, the Japan-China conflict goes back well before World War Two. Japan already owned parts of China and all of Korea before World War One, actually, in regards to the Russia-Japanese War of 1904-1905. The Japanese won that conflict and had large parts of northern China and Korea, and then they started expanding into the rest of mainland China. Taiwan was technically part of the Japanese Empire, where the nationalists ended up. So Taipei, which the Chinese and Taiwanese, claim each other's territory, and technically in a state of semi-war anyway, and occasionally fire shells at each other and launch some missiles at each other, much like North and South Korea. It is an under-discussed topic when it comes to history in school in the West. It's a difficult topic for the Japanese and the two Chinas, if you could, Taipei and Beijing, in regards to war crimes committed and the conflict as a whole. Um, and it's still a very touchy subject for the Japanese people and the Chinese people. But a lot of that to do is, again, with American foreign policy in the Pacific. Under Roosevelt especially, it actually sped up World War II in the Pacific. It increased Japanese militarism in the Pacific. And this is the danger when you have, dictators or very nationalistic governments in power. You put sanctions on them, they get more drastic, they get more desperate, they do things which are more dangerous. And with North Korea, I don't think the Americans have learned anything from the 1930s. Personally, Putin, most intimidating president ever. He's pretty intimidating. I would say. I don't think he's as popular now as what he was in 1999 when he took over from Boris Yeltsin. There's a lot of issues between the in recent years between um, Russia and the West in regards to a lot of things. You could say in regards to Belarus is a flashpoint in Europe, Ukraine, the foreign policy, spheres of influence, a whole range of whole range of a whole range of issues. Russia's an interesting case. They have a lot of natural energy resources that a lot of European nations, especially natural gas, European nations are reliant upon. Several of the EU states have concerns with their borders. Uh, you know, it's an interesting thing. Russia's an uh, interesting topic at the moment in regards to um, in regards to a whole range of issues. Previous US administrations have put sanctions on high level Russian individuals, trying to put pressure on the Russian Federation in regards to economic sanctions. Obviously, the Ukraine situation and the ongoing low intensity conflict in eastern Ukraine is an ongoing issue that hasn't been resolved. The Crimea situation hasn't been resolved. It's. I don't think we're at the same level as what we were in the Cold War, but um, there's certain flashpoints that need resolution. Absolutely, but it's something that obviously who the Biden administration's got to tread carefully. Their foreign policy mess that they've already made. Uh, Biden is not as popular as people think. American politics is heavily polarized. The Russians are jumping on that, um, you know, and have done. We know there's been Russian interference in a whole load of things. Um, there's political opposition is there, but is whether who follows Putin is the problem. But he is intimidating. He's one of the longest ruling heads of state. Apart from the 4 years when Medvedev was president, that Russia's had since the Tsars and communism. You know, it's an interesting dynamic with what happens. We'll have to see what happens. In my opinion, the situation is tense when it comes to uh, the Russians and uh, Western Europe and the US. I think the US have mishandled so many things in foreign policy, but then you look at their domestic policy and it's not much better. They've mishandled a lot of things domestically. Look what's happening in Texas with the abortion law. That's gone down like a sack of fucking shit. Um, and I will be interested to see how many women in the legislature in Texas voted in favour of that policy. Very interested to see how many women in the Texas legislature um, voted in favour of that policy, because that's a domestic policy in the US, and there's no federal law on birth control and abortion. It's to do with each state. Um, and there's still a division between North and South in the US that has never fully been healed. And it's staunch Republican country, staunch conservative country, Bible Belt. It's going to be interesting to see what happens if that law is upheld or if it's repealed in state or federal court. Um, it's going to be an interesting one, very interesting one. Um, the fact that Joe Biden has also said that America are no longer the global police. I mean, the fact that their foreign policy for decades has been shambolic, has damaged their reputation overseas. I don't think Trump has helped with their reputation overseas. Um, there's obviously been some bad policy decisions under several presidents um, for a very, very long time. Um, but America's standing has been very badly damaged. Very badly damaged. And there's various European political parties that are not so keen on American policy, um, which has led to issues in European policy as well. There's definitely a growing disconnect um, between the US and especially Europe and the rest of the Americas as well. There's definitely issues there. We haven't even got to Australia and New Zealand, which also have interests with the US. There's a lot of US personnel in Australia. Uh, that can be a contentious issue on Australian domestic policy with the US personnel based in especially the Northern Territory in Queensland. There's definitely debates in Australia about that, and whether that helps or hinders security in the region. Uh, there's also, issues um, to do with the response to the pandemic. And America's response was, again, on a state level, not federal level. Each state had its own um, policies in regards to vaccination, lockdowns, curfews, uh, public health. Um, so there's been no um, federal shutdown. Same in Canada, same in Australia, because you've got state legislatures. Um, I would say the UK has mishandled its response to the COVID pandemic badly as well, in various instances. And there is rumours circulating that there may be another lockdown in October. I mean, if that comes to pass, that's going to be carnage, absolute carnage. If the I mean, I'm fully vaccinated. I mean, most people are fully vaccinated, but we're seeing these vaccine passport policies that we were told weren't going to be a thing. So yeah, some civil liberties are changing, um, and that's a discussion not just here in the UK but across the world. A vaccine passport, forced vaccination in certain industries, and as a sports fan, yes, that is something that has political consequences as well. Um, Sport and politics, unfortunately, have become very intertwined. And we saw the Japanese Tokyo Olympics go ahead with no fans a year late. We've now seen the Rugby League World Cup postponed by another year. Um, and there's been political involvement in these things, with sporting bodies being given emergency loans, you know, um, sports events being cancelled because governments have said no sporting events can take place, like in France. Restrictions on large gatherings, include sports arenas. What we've seen in Australia with lockdowns in various states and the various professional leagues having to basically relocate to Queensland and Western Australia in order for them to be completed, because there's a financial incentive, and of course the sports economy does generate a lot of income. And I've been following that as well. I mean, we've seen over here, capacities being allowed to full capacity again. Whether that's the right thing or not, is yet to be seen. I don't think it's the right thing to have full capacity at this point, considering looking at the data. Although, beginning of the year, mostly on the main channel, when I was discussing, sports fans and stadiums and looking forward to the Rugby League World Cup, which has been postponed by a year, and the Euros, I was more hopeful, that we would have capacities back to some capacities allowed. The fact we're at full capacity now, I have some concerns about that. And I know people who've had to isolate because of COVID. My brother's had it, my sister's had it, my sister's husband's had it, my mum's had it, my stepdad's had it. They've had to isolate. They've been seriously ill. My ex-partner had it. Um, Several friends had it and had to isolate. And this is in the vaccination period. So, you know, I'm fully vaccinated. I have no doubt in my mind that this is going to become a regular thing, especially for those vulnerable groups. We're having discussions domestically about vaccination of under 17 kids, school kids. Um, you know, is this the new normal? I think I'm if I'm brutally honest, the pandemic hasn't overly affected me per se in my job and in myself. I've carried on pretty much as normal. Social life's been a bit restricted, but it hasn't overly affected me being able to go to work every day. The only way I've been affected is the panic buying in the initial beginning and the shortages we're seeing now for a variety of reasons, be it COVID or Brexit. But otherwise, I haven't been overly affected. The same can't be said for others. I have had several friends who've basically been furloughed for a long time. I know people who've been seriously ill with the virus. And you can say domestic policy in regards to the response to the pandemic has been haphazard and not very good. And it'd be very interesting to see when it comes to the next local elections and future elections how that's portrayed when it comes to voters and how people feel about taking their opinions to the polls. And I do believe several governments will be voted out because of their response to the pandemic. Several governments will fall. Economically, will there be a bounce back? Absolutely, there will be. Will it take time? We shall see. But after every great pandemic, there's always an economic bounce back. So we will see what happens economically in response over the next 18 months to 5 years. And politically, it will be interesting to see what happens. Very interesting to see what happens. But it's in regards to the political situation. Let's just see what's happening. Obviously, there's been a few acts of parliament, especially the social health, and right. This is just broken. Scotland is to launch vaccine passports on the 1st of October. Plans to allow only fully vaccinated people into nightclubs and other large events have been approved by the Scottish Parliament. Not keen on that. Universities have also been told to give students face-to-face teaching. And there's been growing calls for the Met Commissioner, Karaza-Dick, to resign. These are the main news stories. So yeah, the Scottish government vaccine passports are only the fully vaccinated. I think that's a dangerous step to go down because that it causes social exclusion. Because there are those who can't be vaccinated on medical grounds or religious grounds, and I'm not a big fan of anti-vaxxers, but those who have legitimate grounds not to be vaccinated, it's a concern. But Scotland launching vaccine passports on the 1st of October, that's 3 weeks away. I think that is a very slippery slope, considering this time last year we were told this wouldn't be a thing. Not policy. We're not going to do it. It's temporary restrictions on civil liberties. That's now a permanent civil liberty restriction. And industry leaders in the entertainment sector have said you're just going to kill the industry completely. And that is an industry that generates a lot of revenue. So will that extend to sports venues? Highly likely. Indoor venues, so that's ice rinks, so that's nightclubs. That is a worrying trend, and I think the national government will follow. Now, I'm fully vaccinated, but I am against vaccine passports, and I think there's going to be a backlash. There's going to be pushback. It'll be interesting to see how the Scottish Parliament voted, who voted against that policy, and who voted in favour of that policy. And it'll be interesting to see what the Scottish electorate think of it when it comes to the next Scottish parliamentary election. But that is an interesting breaking news. And I think that could be the norm rather than the exception to the rule. I generally do. That in itself is very interesting. And I know that I have Scottish viewers and subscribers, and I know that's going to be very interesting to see how that impacts the entertainment industry. It really will. I have genuine concerns over how that's going to impact the entertainment sector and the sports industry in general, because I think that will also extend to outdoor events as well. And that is something that we were told, wasn't going to happen. So there's already a lack of trust with the political establishment, and there has been for many years. I think that, again, young people are already feeling that disconnect and have done for many years with political process that could push social exclusion. And we've already seen social exclusion during the pandemic, especially in vulnerable groups. There are people who have become socially excluded in a variety of things. There's education exclusion, which has now become a hot topic. There's concerns over a whole variety of things, but that is a worrying, very worrying turn of events, in my view. I think that is wrong. I think, not keen on that. The only way I can see that being acceptable is if it is a temporary measure until the infection rate and the vaccination rate is at around 90%. The concern is with kids going back to school. We know they're super spreaders. We know, that there's a debate over vaccination of teenagers and kids currently being had. But that is a very worrying turn of events, in my view, when it comes to civil liberties long term. If it's a temporary decision, I can accept that, but if that is a long-term permanent decision, then I don't know where we stand. But there is already a growing disconnect between young people, especially, who this will target, and in the pub and restaurant trade's been hammered, the entertainment sector's been hammered. Even before COVID, the amount of licensed premises closing down was already quite rapid and has only accelerated. People lost their jobs in that sector. I've got friends who manage pubs and clubs and restaurants for years who don't see a viability in the sector anymore. And that is a worrying turn of events. There is no doubt on that. So we will see what happens in regards to the rest of the UK and other countries imposing vaccine passports as a legislative and policy. But I can see some political and social pushback on that. And how is it going to be enforced, and will it be enforced effectively? And how will it have a positive effect or a negative effect? And I think it will have a negative effect, and I think more businesses will struggle. And there's already been critics of any policy of vaccine passports from industry leaders ever since vaccinations were started back in March. And I can see further issues with that going forward. And that is a worrying turn of events. A very worrying turn of events. And we shall see how that affects things moving forward. But yeah, concerns were raised by industry leaders in regards to vaccine passports last year and this year throughout the summer. It's a concerning thing. There's issues over implementation, but for me, social exclusion, I think, is a big worry. It overly affects the 18-30 age group, which is concerning. That is something that needs to be obviously considered, and rightfully so. I think that's something that needs to be considered. I think there's definitely some drawbacks to that, and that's something I think I'll discuss on the other channel. Anyway, I'm going to leave that there because there's not a lot really else to say. I think that is the biggest political thing to happen today, and is something that needs to be discussed in due course. But thank you very much for watching, and I'll have some more videos for you soon.